Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Stephen Shivone.
Thank you, Travis, or Mr. Cooper, sorry. I am grateful to Dean Letney, Mr. Rosado, and the entire faculty of TAC West for your gracious hospitality and for the invitation to speak this evening, which has afforded me several wonderful blessings, some extra time with my daughter Zosha after the Christmas vacation, an opportunity to see old colleagues and friends here in California, and much time this fall spent in the company of Homer, Lord of highest song, as Dante calls him. Thank you for these gifts. Love and friendship are probably the last things readers think of when they read the Iliad or contemplate its main character, Achilles. For many readers, the Iliad feels like one long, tedious battle, just death after death, a series of blood and guts pictures of the weary work of fighting in which Trojans and Achaeans, quote, like wolves spring upon one another with man against man in the onfall, end quote. Undoubtedly, the brutal realities of war are at the center of the poem, as seen in the many graphic, often medically precise catalogs and set scenes of, quote, men killing and being killed. Homer narrates the deaths, often with brief honorific obituaries, of 170 Trojan and 50 Achaean named characters in the Iliad. Images of bitter strife, terror, anger, delusion, grief, sorrow pervade Homer's narrative from its very first word, rage, to the final burning of the body of Hector. The whole poem seems consumed by the glorious wrath and spirited valor of its heroes, with its resulting bloodshed, violence, and carnage. Not unfittingly, is fire its primary synthetic image, a thing both destructive and brilliantly beautiful, binding together its major themes of honor, glory, heroic excellence, anger, courage, and mortality. And the greatest of its heroes, Achilles, who becomes a veritable man on fire in the later books in the inhuman savagery of his Aristeia. That's just a Greek word that means something like the attainment or manifestation of the excellence, if you will, of a hero. Achilles in this Aristeia in the later books is the most violent and destructive thing of all. He seems much more an enemy than a friend, even to his own people. The Iliad has aptly then been described as, quote, a picture of uniform horror and the poem of death, and Achilles as a strong, iron-hearted manslayer. That Achilles is described like that in a wonderful poem by 20th century poet W.H. Auden. And for good reason, has much scholarly commentary focused on Homer's profound, complex, and tragic representation of the heroic life and culture whose highest ideal is to achieve epic glory through martial prowess, honorable killing, and noble death on the battlefield. Unlike in the Odyssey, if the things pertaining to love, friendship, marriage, family, and so on, appear at all in the Iliad, they seem to do so on the edges, in the similes, for example, many of which glance at a world of peace remote from the world of the poem. Consequently, it comes as a surprise when someone as perceptive of and sensitive to the horrors that fill the Iliad as French thinker Simone Weil, who famously maintained that the Iliad is an anti-war poem whose hero is what she calls force, which turns human beings into things. When a reader like this says that, quote, there is hardly any form of pure love known to humanity of which the Iliad does not treat, end quote. As Weil notes, the Iliad is replete with images of love, of fathers and mothers for their children, especially, I would note, bereaved fathers and mothers, of children for their parents, of brothers, of husband and wife, of friends, of comrades at arms, and even of enemies. She notes, however, and not unreasonably, that these images of love, quote, have hardly any place in this study of extremes and unjust acts of violence, though they, again, quote, nevertheless bathe the work in their light without ever becoming noticeable themselves, except as a kind of accent, end quote. Moreover, according to Vey, they serve mainly, again a quote, to make us feel with sharp regret what it is that violence has killed and will kill again. I think especially in that connection of Book 6. Following Vey's provocative suggestions, I want to explore the place of love in Homer's Iliad, indicating that much more than an accent, love is thematically important in the Iliad, especially in the character and drama of its major hero, Achilles. I contend that if we are to understand and properly respond to the beautifully terrible story of Achilles, it is necessary to appreciate the role of love and friendship in it. My chief claim is that Achilles is not only an extreme in wrath and heroic excellence, as is commonly acknowledged, but in friendship and love. What I mean by extreme will be spelled out, I hope, in the course of my exposition. My talk has two parts. In the first, I consider the place of love in the character of Achilles and its essential role in his tragedy. In the second, I consider how Achilles' love relates to his plot or arc in the poem, which culminates in the encounter with Priam in Book 24. Two brief, not unimportant preliminaries demand mention. First, I am concerned in this talk with Homer's representation of love between persons, particularly the love of friendship, and with the desire for such love, which, as I will try to show, is very powerful in Achilles. Accordingly, when I use the term love and related expressions, I am referring to the sort of love that exists between friends, between those who are dear to each other and who in some sense wish each other well, and to the actions and affections that show or accompany such love, things like compassion, mercy, the desire to share life and goods with another, attentiveness to the needs and wishes of others, and so forth. These actions and emotions are done and felt toward those at different degrees of remove from the one who loves, in the case of my talk, Achilles, toward one's family members, one's closest friends, one's comrades in arms, or even toward a stranger or an enemy. In this connection, it's important to note that in Homer, the love of friendship seems opposed in some way to purely erotic love, such as that of Helen and Paris. In Homer's terms, I think, Paris and Helen are not friends. This erotic sort of love seems principally concerned with sexual pleasure in Homer and destructive of the happiness of individuals and cities. The disordered love of Paris is, on the human level, the primary cause of the terrible disaster that has befallen the Trojans in the Iliad. Homer does not, however, as we sometimes do, oppose the love of friendship to the love between man and woman in marriage or between family members. Hector and Andromache, I think, in his terms, are friends. Second, I want to stress that Homer's narrative art is exceedingly dense, subtle, and complex. Here is no noble naivety or crude primitive technique. Homer's message, if you will, is communicated not directly and explicitly, but in the manner of the highest poetic art, by indirection, implication, and symbolization, relying heavily on terms such as epithets, objects, scenes, and structures such as parallelism, that signify general perspectives beyond the literal level of the poem, perspectives political, moral, and even theological or metaphysical. This quality of his art, which is more or less universally acknowledged now in the scholarly community, at least in the United States, one author beautifully says somewhere that Homer hears the hum of the accidents. That's a wonderful way of putting it, I think. This quality of his art poses the danger of inviting the reader to hallucinate schemes and deep meanings that are not really there. I hope I've not done that. I turn to my first section, love and the character of Achilles. Fittingly, the very first word of the Iliad refers to the passion that primarily defines Achilles' character, wrath, anger, or perhaps better, rage. In the drama that follows, the Iliad explores, in the manner of an image, the passion of anger, its forms, causes, effects, both human and divine. It takes us deep inside this passion, as if into a smoke-filled hole. As many commentators have noted, Homer's word choice here at the beginning is peculiar. For the word he chooses, menis, is the word he uses there, generally refers to the anger of a god, not that of a human being. Homeric Greek has several other words for anger, which are much more common in the Iliad, but Homer chooses to begin his poem with this one. The word menis is used of no other mortal besides Achilles in the Iliad. Though the other heroes are godlike and said to be godlike in many ways, even in their anger, none are like the gods in their anger to such an extreme degree as Achilles. As each of the gods tends to be defined, even in Homer, I think, by a predominant passion or attribute, Aphrodite, for example, by erotic desire, so Achilles is defined by anger of different sorts. There are a number of different words for his anger throughout the poem. He is the absolute or ideal form of anger, we might say. From the opening quarrel with Agamemnon in Book 1, to the sullen refusal of the embassy in Book 9, to the demented fury of his climactic Aristeia in Books 20 and 21, Achilles is moved principally by the passion of anger. And considered as a whole, his anger is a menis, an anger that remembers, in the words of the tragedian Aeschylus, and that serves as a kind of divine sanction for the violation of a cosmic law, like the anger of a god. Besides anger, however, it's my contention that what defines Achilles' character is a love of friends and a desire for union with another in friendship. I know this sounds strange, given the frequent references to Achilles as something of an exemplar of pitilessness, and given that Achilles' principal choices and actions seem decidedly harmful and even cruel towards his friends and comrades. Indeed, in Poetics 15, chapter 15, Aristotle says that Achilles is a paradigm of cruelty or hard-heartedness, though he mentions in the same breath that Achilles is good. Agathon is the strong Greek word he uses, and he doesn't use that very often in the Poetics. Nonetheless, the facts seem to bear out my contention. Take his very first act. Moved by pity for the plague-stricken Achaeans, who are being punished by the anger of Apollo over Agamemnon's outrageous treatment of his priest, Hera, a symbol of the pity that moves Achilles here, I think, inspires Achilles to call an assembly to discuss how to address the problem. Achilles' intervention is an act of friendship toward his afflicted comrades, though it may have other motivations as well, I think. He wants to relieve their suffering, and by selecting to begin the action of the poem here, Homer puts this aspect of his character before our eyes from the beginning. Achilles' desire for friendship is implicit in subtle ways in the opening quarrel with Agamemnon as well, though this is harder to see. Though this seems like a strange thing to say, this seems like a strange thing to say. Achilles' reaction to Agamemnon's insult, however understandable as a response to a grievous injustice, seems excessive to most readers. Punishing the whole Achaean army for Agamemnon's violation of his personal honor seems unjust, even if it conforms to the generally accepted moral codes governing this community of warriors, and even if it bears a likeness to Apollo's angry response earlier in Book 1 to Agamemnon's dishonoring of his priest. Remember, Achilles' wrath is a menis, a godlike wrath. In any case, surely fellow feeling, love, and affection have nothing to do with it. In the light of things that emerge later in Books 1 and 9, however, we can see, I think, that Achilles' great anger arises from deep tensions in his soul. The principal cause, in fact, there are many, I think, but the principal cause seems to be his so-called fate. Let me explain. As we learn in the scene following the quarrel in Book 1, when Achilles seeks the help of his goddess mother Thetis in redressing the dishonor he has suffered, Achilles has been born to a short life. Homer evokes the painful divisions in his soul right at the beginning of the scene. And I quote, "But Achilles weeping went and sat in sorrow apart from his companions beside the beach of the gray sea, looking out on the infinite water. Many times, stretching forth his hands, he called on his mother. Since, my mother, you bore me to be a man with a short life, therefore Zeus of the loud thunder on Olympus should grant me honor at least. But now he has given me not even a little. Now the son of Atreus, powerful Agamemnon, has dishonored me, since he has taken away my prize and keeps it." End quote. The quarrel with Agamemnon has the effect of plunging him into a personal crisis over his fate or choice, there's some ambiguity there we could talk about, of a glorious but short life. As we learn in Book 9, he has rejected a long life of peace and domestic enjoyments in favor of a short life of martial excellence, rewarded by honor in life and imperishable glory after death. He has staked everything on a short but honored and glorious life, and this is the primary reason for his presence in the Trojan War. It is the theater where he will win glory, in Homer's oft-repeated phrase. The loss of honor, then, touches a most sensitive point in his soul, for honor is the ultimate good to which Achilles has dedicated his life. Moreover, he is aware of the grave injustice being done to him. He is the best of the Achaeans, and thus the most deserving of honor. This experience of dishonor awakens him to the painful realization of the fragility of the good to which he has dedicated his life, which can so easily be snatched from him by another. This is simply the nature of honor. It's more in the one honoring than in the one honored. And to the even more distressing perception that being honored in life was not, as he seems to have assumed, part of the bargain. Achilles, sitting on the shore like an isolated piece at draughts, alienated from his community, apolitical, you might say, lamenting his fate as he looks out at the infinite water, across which perhaps lies his home in Phthia, and the life he has rejected, is a perfect image of the tragic division this incident has aroused in his soul. At the end of Book 1, he is a man on the threshold between two lives, as it were. It's worth noting as an aside that his alienation from his community leads to a kind of leaving of the cultural cave. Achilles becomes reflective, even philosophical, about his life and the goods valued in his culture, as we see in Book 9. Throughout the poem, Achilles has a more universal outlook than any of the human characters and most of the gods. In this respect, he is like Zeus and Hephaestus. He seems to see things as a whole in some sense. In fact, he literally sees the whole when he looks at the shield Hephaestus makes for him. In any case, his inner division after the quarrel shows us a man who, though the paragon of warriors, has a deep longing for that other life, which stands throughout Homer in starkest contrast to the life of glorious war and death, the life of home, peace, and as Achilles himself often mentions, marriage. For Achilles, such a life is a road not taken, and the cost of his decision is still very much with him at the beginning of the story. Is it too much to say, then, that even Achilles' outrage, his menace, reveals the presence, even prominence in his soul, of a longing for the life he has rejected, a life of love, friendship, family, and peace? I don't think it is. Indeed, Achilles' longing for this other life is also brought out through another aspect of the opening scene, namely, through the contrast between his and Agamemnon's different attitudes toward their war prize concubines, Briseis and Chryseis. While Agamemnon cares more for his concubine than for his own wife back home, Achilles loves his concubine as a wife, as one who is dear to him. As Agamemnon says of his concubine Chryseis in Book 1, "Indeed, I wish greatly to have her in my house, since I like her better than Clytemnestra, my own wife. For in truth she is in no way inferior, neither in build, nor stature, nor wit, not in accomplishment." End quote. Note the perspective toward his wife here, that he does not see her as dear to him and as preferable simply by virtue of being his own. He is shamelessly detached from what is his own, we might say. All he can see is that she is inferior in certain objectively desirable qualities. Such a perspective is especially shameful because Agamemnon is leading an all-out war on a whole people to punish an offense against the institution of marriage. Though we do not see it clearly until Book 9, Agamemnon's attitude toward women in marriage stands in contrast to Achilles. Unlike Agamemnon, Achilles cares deeply about those near and dear to him. In his long, passionate, almost artless response to Odysseus's contrastingly artful speech, urging him to rejoin the battle to save the Achaeans from further destruction at the flaming hands of Hector the Huge, Achilles speaks of Briseis as one dear to him, even as a wife. I quote, "But from me alone of all the Achaeans he has taken and keeps the bride of my heart. Let him lie beside her and be happy. But why must the Argives fight with the Trojans? And why was it the son of Atreus assembled and led here these people? Was it not for the sake of lovely-haired Helen? Are the sons of Atreus alone among mortal men the ones who love their wives? Since any who is a good man and careful loves her who is his own and cares for her, even as I now loved this one from my heart, though it was my spear that won her." These lines reveal that Achilles loves Briseis, his concubine, deeply, as one who is his own, one he cares for. Moreover, Achilles' three questions here express an irony, for as Agamemnon openly admits in Book 1, he does not care about his wife, because he finds the company and person of his concubine more to his liking. This ironic contrast serves to highlight that Achilles properly and deeply cares about those near and dear to him, and unlike Agamemnon, who is indifferent to his own wife, Achilles seems to yearn for the close intimacy of marital friendship. Dwelling further on the embassy scene in Book 9, we see other signs of Achilles' love of his friends. When the three ambassadors first arrive at Achilles' shelter, he greets them in the following manner. "Welcome. You are my friends," philoi is the word, "who have come, and greatly I need you, who even to this my anger are dearest," that's philtatoi, "of all the Achaeans." End quote. Later, in his reply to Odysseus' opening appeal, he speaks of, quote, "the great desire in my heart that drives me to that place," home in Phthia, "to take a wedded wife in marriage, the bride of my fancy, to enjoy with her the possessions won by aged Peleus." End quote. In the next appeal, that of his aged mentor Phoenix, a most important appeal for all sorts of reasons we cannot delve into here, Phoenix speaks of teaching Achilles to be an excellent speaker of words and doer of deeds. Of course, we assume Phoenix has in mind the assembly and the battlefield, in which men win honor for their excellence. Indeed, at the end of Book 1, Homer describes Achilles as longing for these two heroic arenas of honor. But in this intimate, private scene with Phoenix, we see another excellence, I think, on full display in Achilles' words and deeds. A tender, devoted love of friends. Their interactions reveal a deep affection for each other. Phoenix repeatedly calls him dear child and is moved but to anxious tears at the threat to return home Achilles has just issued. Because, quote, "apart from you, dear child, I would not be willing to be left behind." Later in his speech, he tells Achilles that he, quote, "loves him out of his heart." Achilles speaks with equal tenderness to Phoenix, telling him openly that he loves him and calling him my father. Even when Achilles warns Phoenix to stop making appeals on behalf of Agamemnon, he expresses his warning in terms of love for Phoenix. He says, quote, "for fear you turn hateful to me who love you." Strikingly, he tells Phoenix that he wants to share, quote, "half his honor with him," and kindly invites him to stay, having a soft bed made up, and thus assuaging Phoenix's anxiety about being left behind in Troy without the one he loves most. The final desperate appeal of the third ambassador, Ajax, the second greatest hero of the Achaean army according to the ranking of excellence in the catalog of ships in Book 2, brings out the same aspect of Achilles with even greater force. Unlike the appeals of the other two ambassadors, Ajax's appeal urges Achilles to return less out of pragmatic self-interest to gain a greater share of external wealth and signs of honor, and more for the sake of pity and, quote, "friends' affection." He remarks on Achilles' heart, saying that it has become hard, pitiless, and begs him to make gracious the spirit within him. In plaintive tones, Ajax asks him to open his eyes and see, that's his word, that his close friends and the entire Achaean army want, quote, beyond all others, to have your honor and love. And Achilles' reply to Ajax' heartfelt appeal of friendship is the most revealing touch of all. He says that all that Ajax has said, quote, seems spoken after my own mind. What Ajax has said, in other words, expresses Achilles' own feelings about the situation, and accordingly, the appeal that most moves him, it doesn't finally move him, is the one made in terms of friendship, pity, and affection. Though ultimately the embassy fails and Achilles refuses to return out of anger and perhaps uncertainty about what is best, Achilles replies to the embassy in Book 9, and his lovingly attentive treatment of his mentor Phoenix emphatically reveal his deep love for his friends and his longing for such love. They show that he perceives and speaks of his actions and decisions in terms of things like desire, affection, friendship. When he speaks of marriage, he does so not in official or institutional terms, but as a union of love. And in the parts of his replies to Odysseus and Phoenix that we have noted, he speaks of the importance of sharing his life, possessions, and even his honor with another. He shows a great capacity for friendship and a longing not just for life or possessions or honor, but for sharing those things in common with others. He says that he wants, quote, a bride of his fancy to enjoy the possessions won by his father, and that he wants to share half his honor with Phoenix. More than anything else, he wants a life in common with friends. In addition to his wrath, then, we can justifiably say that love, in the sense proper to friendship, is what defines his character, and that he longs for the common life and shared goods of friendship. I hope I do not seem to be getting carried away with this. Forgive me if I am. Nonetheless, one other thing needs mention that more than anything else shows this side of Achilles we are drawing out. I refer, of course, to his friendship with Patroclus. I've not yet mentioned their beautiful friendship, one of the greatest in Western literature, because it seems to be the most obvious evidence of this aspect of Achilles' character, and to show that what most deeply affects him, even in his inclination to anger, is his loving friendship with others. In discussing in a moment what I see as a kind of evolution in his character as regards his love of friends, I will say a bit more about how Achilles' love of Patroclus is central to his epic and tragic choice of a heroic life and death in Book 18. But here 2 points will suffice to show the nature of this friendship and its importance for a correct estimation of Achilles' character. The first and most obvious is that Achilles loves Patroclus more than he loves anyone. Patroclus is his nearest and dearest friend, his other self. This is brought out tragically in Achilles' sorrowful speech upon hearing of Patroclus' death, which Eric Voegelin, this political philosopher, calls the psychological masterpiece of the Iliad. After his mother reminds him that Patroclus' death is what in Book 1 he, quote, lifted his hands and prayed for unknowingly, when he swore his terrible oath on the scepter and supplicated Zeus that, quote, all the sons of the Achaeans be pinned on their grounded vessels by reason of your loss and suffer things that are shameful. Achilles, when he says that about all the Achaeans suffering, he of course doesn't fully grasp the meaning of that all, that it includes Patroclus, finally. So Achilles, sighing heavily, says to Thetis here, my mother, all these things the Olympian brought to accomplishment, but what pleasure is this to me, since my dear companion has perished, Patroclus, whom I loved beyond all other companions, as well as my own life. End quote. Achilles, we see here and in other places, regards Patroclus as the one he loves most. He is the one most dear, the best friend, as we would now say. In one of the always illuminating ancient scholia, these are wonderful if you ever have a chance to look at these. In one of these always illuminating ancient scholia for line 82 of the passage just quoted, where Achilles says that he loved Patroclus beyond all other companions or friends, as well as my own life, the scholiast refers to the life of Pythagoras, where the wise man is asked, "What is a friend?" and receives the answer, "Another self," or allos ego, or alter ego in Latin. Achilles takes no pleasure in anything, not even honor or glory, now that his dearest friend has died. "What pleasure is this to me?" he groaningly cries. No character besides Achilles in the Iliad has a friend like this, an earthly dearest, another self, just as no character speaks of others in terms of friendship and affection as frequently or passionately as Achilles. The second point about Achilles' friendship with Patroclus is related to the first, but a bit subtler, for Patroclus seems not only the dearest object of Achilles' affections, but also a kind of reflection or image of the side of his character that inclines him to friendship and concern for the good of others. I don't want to push this too far, but Patroclus' character does seem to take on the nature of a metaphor for part of the self, if you will, or character of Achilles. One sign of this is Patroclus' distinction as indisputably the gentlest, most tender-hearted, most loving figure in the whole of the Iliad. Eva Braun says, quote, "He's simply the most lovable man in the Iliad." As Achilles is like a pure form of wrath through much of the work, so is Patroclus like a pure form of kindness, friendliness, and compassion. All of his words and deeds off the battlefield, especially his treatment of Achilles' concubine Briseis, display the supreme gentleness and, as we now might say, unselfishness of his character. He is also distinguished by his knowledge of the art of medicine, an art, interestingly, that he learned from Achilles. He is a healer, and he is the one Achilles sends to investigate when, unable to ignore the suffering of his comrades after he rejects the embassy. Achilles sees that one of the Achaean warriors has been wounded and taken off the battlefield to be treated. It is as if Patroclus expresses or reflects Achilles' love of his fellow Achaeans, functioning as a kind of pure instantiation of it. Perhaps the most striking image of this is that Patroclus goes into battle wearing Achilles' armor, as does Hector after he strips it from Patroclus' body. Patroclus in the armor of Achilles becomes literally then the image of Achilles. And it may be that when Patroclus dies, his death represents the death of the side of Achilles he represents, at least for a time. Before turning to Achilles' development, I want to conclude this discussion of his character by noting that Achilles' love of friends is essential to his tragedy. In fact, it is so essential that if we do not see the role it plays in his tragedy, we will likely feel disgust or horror toward Achilles. I do not think this is the intention of Homer, nor did the ancients, even if certain actions of Achilles do evoke our moral revulsion. Achilles' love of friends is essential to his tragedy, I think, because it is the conflict between his love of his friends and his anger, his menace, which puts him at enmity with his friends, that leads to the tragic decision to consent to Patroclus' request to return to battle, and the subsequent loss of the one he loves most. As he says in Book 18, as he grieves over the death of Patroclus, "I stayed too long out of the fighting." The struggle, but I don't really have time to provide proper evidence for this particular claim, but we could talk about it in the Q&A. The struggle between his anger and his love is the source of his tragic error and suffering. Achilles gets the honor he requests of Zeus, but not in the way he wants. The price of his triumph and glorification is the destruction of everything he loves and the one dearest to him. As Jakob Klein beautifully and accurately draws out in one of his essays, Zeus has arranged things so that in something akin to some of the ironies later found in St. John's Gospel, Achilles' moment of greatest glory and triumph is at the same time the moment of his greatest defeat and misery. As Klein notes, this conjunction is of the essence of the tragic. When Achilles first appears to the Trojans with fire blazing from his head, as he prepares to enter the apogee of his glory as savior of his people and the doom bringer to Troy, the shout he lets forth is one of utter desolation. For his attainment of honor and glory for himself has killed his dearest friend. The glories and satisfactions offered by heroic life have turned to ashes in his mouth. Though Achilles wants both friendship and honor, as he shows in his prayer to Zeus after he agrees to send Patroclus into battle, Zeus will only allow one or the other, not both. I turn now to my second section, love and the development or arc of Achilles. The story of Achilles is not merely tragic, however. It is even more fundamentally epic. We could talk about that distinction in the Q&A if you'd like. And his drama hinges on an epic choice of heroic life and death, which he makes in Book 18 after learning of the death of Patroclus. This choice, its causes, both human and divine, and consequences, determines the plot of the whole Iliad. In my discussion so far, I've sought to draw out the presence in his character of love, especially love of friends. I've also noted that his deep internal conflicts arise from the conflict between his love of friends and his anger over the loss of his honor at the hands of Agamemnon, and that the death of Patroclus is the tragic consequence of this conflict. After the death of Patroclus in the last 6 books, where the final stages of his development are depicted, his wrath and his love are again closely interwoven, though in strange ways. These last books are very difficult to understand because the highly mysterious and paradoxical symbolism, an apocalyptic explosion of poetic figuration, threatens almost to overwhelm the literal of the poem at this point. A full account of the meaning of this rich figuration is beyond the scope of this paper. I simply want to note 3 things about the relation between his love and his wrath in these final books before turning to the encounter with Priam as a conclusion. For reasons of time, we cannot do justice to any of these points here, but only sketch an outline of each. The first is that even the most savage things Achilles does in his Aristeia in books 20 and 21, in which he seems to become at once divine and bestial, including his shameful repeated mutilation of Hector's corpse, are done from a devotion to Patroclus and grief over his loss. Again and again, Achilles displays solicitude to ensure that he properly avenges and honors the death of his dearest friend. And he is reluctant to give Hector's corpse back principally because he does not want to offend Patroclus. Patroclus is constantly in his thoughts. Achilles speaks to him, thinks of him, refers to him, and even dreams of him. Even the beheading and sacrifice of the 12 Trojan youths, horrible as it is, he explicitly does to fulfill his promise to Patroclus. The figure of Patroclus haunts these later books. That's the first point, not a pretty one, but faithful to the facts, I think. The second is that while Achilles' violence in these last books exceeds that of any other hero in the poem, thus in some sense showing the measure of his excellence as a hero, his love also becomes more encompassing than anyone else's in the poem. Though this should not be taken too far, is it not reasonable to see the funeral games of Patroclus in Book 23, a book many people ignore for various reasons, as a kind of extension of Achilles' love for Patroclus to all the Greeks, or at least as a resumption of Achilles' former self, the character we discern behind his compassionate concern for his fellow Greeks prior to the onset of his wrath in Book 1. As master of the games, he seems like an image of the just king, distributing honor equitably with sensitive discrimination of different forms of merit, mediating quarrels and showing pity to the unfortunate. Thus, in his behavior, we see an increase in the extension of Achilles' love, beyond Patroclus, to include others. He even speaks of the Greeks as his, quote, beloved companions. The import of Book 23 goes beyond Achilles' personal conversion or reversion, however, touching on the deep political level of the Iliad. For through the extension of Achilles' love to his fellow Greeks and the just distribution of honor, he restores order to the Achaean community, which fell into disorder through the unjust dishonoring of Achilles in Book 1. The Achaean community is thus, at the end of the Iliad, a sort of city at peace. As in the first city depicted on the shield of Hephaestus, in this city, if you will, the strife that besets all human associations, especially political ones, is enacted and resolved without harm to the community. The last and most important point, however, is that Achilles' epic choice, his choice to return to battle and accept his fate of being the best of the Achaeans, the greatest of heroes, the most perfect exemplar of heroic life and death, is done, as his long speech in Book 18 makes clear, for the sake of Patroclus. His dream of gaining honor from Zeus and sharing it with his closest friend shattered, he accepts the full burden of life and death as the best of the Achaean warriors, with all the necessities and obligations this entails, even to the point of death. For Achilles knows that if he returns to battle in Troy and kills Hector, his own death, a death that is revealed to him in the course of the book with gradually increasing specificity, is soon to follow. By returning to battle, he is choosing his, quote, fated way of early death with utter certainty. He is also willing to acquire imperishable glory, that's Homer's phrase, by his deeds of war, the glory, the Greek is kleos, of being immortalized in the word, the epos, of epic song, though this seems to have little savor for Achilles now. And he makes this choice not for personal honor, but in anger, grief, guilt, and love, to avenge the death of his dearest friend. He lays down his life, in some sense, for his friend, whom he has, by his own tragic error, killed. As Gregory Nagy, in this wonderful book he wrote on the ancient Greek hero, says, just as Patroclus made the epic choice of loving his comrades more than life itself, actually giving up his life for them, so also Achilles will now make the epic choice of giving up his own life for his comrade Patroclus. End quote. Thus, Achilles' most important decision, his acceptance of heroic life and death, which defines his life, is motivated by love of his dearest friend, for the measure of his love determines the measure of his anger and grief over his friend's death. His extreme grief, anger, even guilt on display in the savage excellence of his Aristeia are due to the extremity of his love. We could apply to Achilles what 20th century poet Robert Frost says nobly of the American heroes who fought in the Revolutionary War in his beautiful poem, The Gift Outright. He says, the deed of gift was many deeds of war. The full extremity of Achilles' love is most powerfully revealed, however, in the climactic scene in the Iliad, the encounter with Priam in Book 24. This scene is, without question, one of the greatest in all Western literature. As many have noted, the scene admirably and movingly resolves the drama of Achilles at the same time as it adumbrates, as a kind of shadowy preface, things beyond the limits of the world represented by Homer in the Iliad, things perhaps more discerned by Homer than by any of his characters, even Achilles, who does seem to achieve a kind of wisdom in the book. The whole of Book 24, in fact, is relevant to the theme of this talk, but we cannot possibly do it justice here or to do justice to the encounter between Priam and Achilles. Words fail before such supreme beauty in any case. We will have to be content with a few relevant points. Priam's dangerous journey from Troy through the Achaean camp to the tent of Achilles to supplicate him to return the body of Hector, Priam's most beloved son, parallels by analogy certain key aspects of Achilles' own journey up to this point. We can see this simply on the literal level. Priam's journey is a courageous deed born from deep grief in which he risks his life for the sake of the one dearest to him. But the parallel is even more striking if one considers the metaphorical level of Priam's journey, which, as is firmly established, I think, in the scholarly community, is figured as a journey to Hades. Priam's journey is represented as a hero's journey to the underworld. Sorry, I've lost my place here. There it is. Priam's journey is represented as a hero's journey to the underworld, and Achilles as Hades himself, the god of the dead. There's a huge amount of evidence of this in the book. We might see this as manifesting a distinctive form of heroic excellence, of Aristeia, or a way of being a hero, an act of excellence risking death for the sake of showing honor to a loved one. For this beautiful deed, Priam is glorified by Homer, I think, in the end. Indeed, Achilles himself is moved to wonder at Priam's deed, suggesting he may see it thus too. But if we have attended carefully to the deeper movements at work in Achilles' drama up to this point, as laid out in this talk, we can see that Priam's journey bears a likeness to Achilles' own. Achilles' drama, like Priam's here, is a journey to death for the sake of showing honor and love to the one dearest to him. Theirs is an epic love, if you will, willing to suffer even to the point of death for the one they love. Their love, quote, you might say, bears it out even to the edge of doom, in Shakespeare's immortal words in Sonnet 116. Homer marks the parallel in another way as well by metaphorically comparing Achilles' loss of Patroclus to the loss of a son. Homer metaphorically identifies their separate experiences of loss, a device Homer also uses in the reunion of Odysseus and Penelope in the climactic scene of the Odyssey. As an aside, I note that both of Homer's epics culminate in human beings united in love by shared suffering and looking at each other in wonder. Both poems culminate in that way. Achilles and Priam have gone through the same thing, you might say. Their union is thus not only effective, but real in some sense. Evil is a portion of every human life, as Achilles points out, but in some lives, Zeus dispenses more of evil than of good. Even those of great fortune often suffer a great misfortune, which destroys their happiness. Such are Achilles and Priam, as Achilles intimates in his theological parable of the two urns, in which he becomes the wise teacher of old man Priam. Though he has lived a short life, Achilles' life is complete in some way, and he can look at it as a whole and see that even though he and Priam belong to the special race of heroes, they are merely mortal men doomed to suffering and death. Priam and Achilles are mere mortals, mere human beings, and theirs is a common lot. But as Homer indicates, they also belong to what you might call a special community of suffering, reserved for those who lose those dearest to them, especially those who lose children. I take this phrase, special community of suffering, from a friend of mine who lost his adolescent son in a swimming accident in the ocean during a family vacation. He told me that one enters a special community of suffering through such an experience. It is this shared suffering that internally unites them as they weep together over the loss of their loved ones. It is also the precondition of Achilles' acceptance of Priam's supplication. Achilles accepts the suppliant out of pity, moved by the sight of his misery, which Achilles can now understand sympathetically because of his own sufferings. By his act, Achilles reverses Agamemnon's act of dishonoring a suppliant with which the Iliad opens, and thus, in a sense, restores order to things. In a marvelous symmetry, the Iliad begins with an act of dishonorable, hubristic refusal to return a child to a father, and ends with an act of honorable returning of a child to his father. An act, in the words of Shakespeare's Edgar from Lear, of a most poor man made tame to fortune's blows, who by the art of known and feeling sorrows is pregnant to good pity. Moreover, with respect to his development, this act marks a change in Achilles, who, since the onset of his wrath in Book 1, has refused every suppliant. In Book 9, he refused the embassy's desperate pleas to save the Achaeans from destruction. On the battlefield, he refused every suppliant for his mercy, including Hector. But before his wrath, it was not so, as we see from his very first compassionate act in calling the assembly to address the plague in Book 1, and also from his treatment of suppliants and those he has captured or killed in the cities he has sacked in the course of the 9-year-long war. We learn, for example, that he spared Priam's son Laocoon only recently, selling him into slavery instead of killing him. This is, a very famous scene. We also learn that he gave Andromache's father, Eetion, an honorable burial after killing him. Quote, in the words of Andromache, for his heart respected the dead man. I say this not to whitewash Achilles' often excessively violent nature, but to highlight the competing passions that drive his character and actions. Here then, at the end, his former better self reappears, the self we see at the beginning of the book and in occasional allusions to his characteristic behavior prior to the coming of the wrath, of accepting the suppliant and giving due honor to the living and dead, the noble self obscured by his terrible wrath. His mildness and pity toward his enemy in this final scene shows the restoration of a noble soul to its native nobility, as well as a humble, wise acceptance of the economy of supplication that governs the heroic order and protects it from disaster. Not only do we see Achilles' heart reopened to pity for the misery of others in this scene, we also see his love, if you will, on full display in his treatment of Priam, and through Priam, Hector and the other Trojans. In his prayer to Zeus before he sets forth for Achilles' tent, Priam prays that Zeus will grant that he come to Achilles, quote, for love and pity, and those are two different words in the Greek. That's not just a translation, or that's not just in the English. He could be referring to Zeus's love and pity here, and he could be referring to Achilles. Most translators take it as referring to Achilles. Either way, his prayer is answered, and love and pity are what he receives from both. Zeus lovingly arranges this meeting and protects Priam, and Achilles treats Priam with high courtesy and attentive, even selfless kindness. He washes and anoints Hector's body. With his friends, he lifts the body onto a litter and the litter onto the wagon. He is careful about avoiding anything that might trigger his anger again, showing prudent self-mastery and avoiding another disastrous violation of divine order through wrath. He feeds Priam and advises him where to sleep to avoid detection by the other Greeks. And in a master stroke, he does for Priam precisely what he did for his mentor Phoenix in Book 9, and has a soft bed made for him where he can rest for the night, treating him as he would his own dear father. There is not a trace of self-interest in any of these actions, as far as I can tell. They show an active desire for the good of another, a good in which Achilles himself will not share except through his act. Moreover, Achilles' kindness extends even to Hector and the Trojans. He both honors Hector and affords a temporary peace to the whole Trojan people by granting Priam's request for a 12-day truce in which to, quote, accomplish a complete funeral for great Hector. Thanks to Achilles, Troy will be permitted to hold funeral games and a feast to pay honor befitting their greatest hero, Hector, the best of the Trojans, you might say, just as the Achaeans did for Patroclus. Achilles is thus the instrument of a temporary reordering of the Trojan community. Troy, too, is briefly a city of peace because of the love of Achilles. I conclude. I admit there is something almost grotesque about the violent yoking of extremes in the last books of the Iliad, these strange paradoxical conjunctions in Achilles' drama between epic glory and tragic misery, divine excellence and bestial savagery, the god of death and tender love, arouse in the reader a kind of horrified admiration, as one of my teachers put it. It is indeed unsettling to contemplate Achilles in all his blazing glory slaughtering countless Trojans, a terrible beauty in W.B. Yeats' famous phrase for the leaders of the Easter Rising in Ireland, or to contemplate him as an image of Hades as he lovingly receives Priam. But these are Homer's grotesqueries, not mine. I have merely tried to describe what I see in the poem. These are strange matters indeed, and hard to interpret. However, the investigation carried out here might compel us to reconsider certain common views of Achilles. I will mention only one. It is often said reasonably that Achilles and the other heroes in the poem seek glory as a substitute for real immortality. Their pursuit of glory manifests their profound desire to live forever. This seems true to me, but in need of qualification in the case of Achilles. It may well be that Achilles seeks glory so that at least his name will live forever, even if he does not, and that ultimately his anger is caused by his aversion to human mortality, which he has inherited from his father Peleus. Such a hatred is evident in his oscillation over his two fated ways and in his compulsive mutilation of Hector's body, which symbolizes, I think, his futile resistance to death. But what our analysis of his character and drama suggests is that Achilles hates death not from a love of mere life, or even because he desires immortality, if by immortality is meant the artificial glory of epic song, or a mere quantitative extension of a bodily life of pleasure, such as that offered to Odysseus by Calypso in the Odyssey. Like Odysseus, he does not want mere life, but a life shared with the one dearest to him, a friend. Thus, when Patroclus dies, Achilles no longer wants to live. What he wants, ultimately, is far more than mere life. He wants the fulfillment of a life shared in union with a loved one, and he wants that to last forever. What he wants is something like the beatitude of eternal life. Thank you.